Hello, welcome to video number 5 in our series, Microsoft Certified Professional Developer 4.0 with ASP.NET and C#. Our exam focus is exam 70-515, and the content is owned and created by Ravi Nanganuri, Microsoft MVP, .NET So video number 5, we're going to talk about state management in ASP.NET 4.0. So we mentioned before HTTP is stateless, and therefore ASP.NET is basically a stateless mechanism for web applications. What we mean by that is when you send a response back from a web server based on a request it got, it knows nothing about the next request it gets, where it came from, etc. So it's basically stateless each time. So we have to have a way to maintain state. Now there's no silver bullet for maintaining state. There's no one size fits all, in other words, for maintaining state. It's a pros and cons model that we have to talk about. And we have choices and abilities for state management that exist both on the server side and the client side. So on the server side, we have application state, the cache object, session state, various ways to implement session state, very common. And there are pros and cons to these. The application state's very fast. The cache object, you must learn to use that programmatically. We already saw in the previous video some pros and cons with it. Session state, depending how we implement it, has pros and cons as well. We'll talk about that as we show these in the video, such as like in-process is very fast, but it's not real scalable. The client side, we have things like cookies, view state, query strings, etc. Now, the client side of things might be less secure than the server side of things. We also get a performance penalty because we're pushing some of the stuff over the network with every call, so you can think about bandwidth being used at that point. It's very easy to use. The query string, for example, very easy to use and let's store data, get to data up there. But at the same time, that query string you shouldn't hold sensitive information at all. It's not very secure. People can tamper with it, etc. So I'm going to encourage you to reference our earlier Visual Studio 2008 video series for more about this, more about the pros and cons. Also do research on your own for more about pros and cons before taking the exam. Now I want to demonstrate a couple common techniques, and I've just got a basic web application project here I created from the empty web app template, and I'm simply going to add a web form to this, and we're just going to use this web form as kind of a basis to go over some very basic fundamental things you must know for the exam when we're talking about managing state. Now often we're going to be using session state. You can think of things like a shopping cart ID or a user ID who logs in. This type of thing naturally represents itself something that you may want to store in session. I'm going to use a very simple web form here, but let's just drag and drop a button and a text box. I'll create a basic login form here. So now these controls themselves, such as this text box I'm using here, is able to maintain the text that we type in it through postbacks based on leveraging view state. So just kind of out of the box behind the scenes, there's mechanisms in play such as view state that may be turned on, and it's helping you maintain state, so to speak. Let's do a very simple setup here. I'm going to use just a user ID, which I'm going to grab out of this text box. I'm also going to put a label on the screen for demonstration purposes. We'll see this kind of come to light in a moment. And what we're going to do is imagine a login form. When a user logs into an e-commerce site somewhere, and we want to basically start a session for them and keep their user ID is how we're going to identify them between requests to the web server with the user ID. So we'll store that in session. So what we're going to do is just make a little room here on the screen so we can see this very clearly as we do the demonstration. But the idea is, you can imagine a fancier login screen, but it wouldn't matter. The premise is the same. We're going to take some data that someone types in, such as a user ID, stuff it into a session object, and we're going to show some of the nuances with configuring this. So if I was to basically just create some basic code here, we're just going to set the label object, just so we can see it on the screen, to whatever the user ID happens to be. So things like user IDs, shopping cart IDs, those are common things that you're going to maybe want to keep state for on your web applications. There are lots of other scenarios. You have lots of flexibility and options for doing this. I may have stored this user ID up in the query string, for example. Notice I just type in Ravi as the login name. I hit the button and it just populates on the label very simply. So the code is very simple for this. We're more worried about at this point for the certification exam how to configure state. Now I want to show you that if you weren't going to use session state at all, what you ought to do up here in the page directives is just turn it off. So you're going to get some performance abilities if you would set this to read only, to false. If you're not using session state at all, by default it wants to be true. And again, there's some performance impact to having that session state even enabled, so be aware of that if it's on the exam. Be aware of that as FYI. And again, that driven by page directives, which we keep coming back to, and we referenced from an earlier video as well. You're going to configure session state specifically, and we're talking about the server-side session state now at this point, in the web config file. So you actually have a session state page here. Now the default is in process, and that's going to be stored in actually the ASP.NET Worker process. Now the pros of this, it's very fast. This is the fastest way, and the cons, this is not very stable, as we'll see. Now you have several other options here. SQL Server, there's a custom option now in ASP.NET 4.0, and you have I can just set this to inproc just to show it. Again, this is the default if this entry wasn't even in the web config. So at this point, if you look at my code, I've actually made the code a little bit more robust. All we're doing is checking to see if session exists. If this user ID is already stored in session, we will go ahead and use that and populate the label with it. You should always do this when you're using session objects. Make sure you check something didn't happen, that the object is actually in session. There's no guarantee that it's there. If the session doesn't exist, we're going to create a session object down there with some very basic syntax. Store user ID, whatever is typed into the text box, in that session object. You notice I just have session and then the brackets user ID equals to this. So very simple syntax to store stuff in and out of session. Now it doesn't know at this point, the code, how we're using session. Are we using it in process? Is it stored in SQL Server? Or is it stored out of process? It's just the same syntax no matter how you're going to get to it, set it, grab it, etc. I'll introduce this extra line of code here where I'm simply going to grab the user ID out of the text box. So when somebody types something, that's what we're going to put in session. If the session already exists, once again, we're simply going to display that on the label. I'll set a couple breakpoints to make this point perfectly clear. Once again, right now we're showing in process session. This is the fastest way. This is really only going to work though on your smaller apps that are using one web server. There's problems with this model if you're using a web farm. Be aware of that. Notice the first time through here, session does not exist, so I jump into the else clause, and I'm going to not only grab and put the thing on the label, I'm going to store that user ID in session for subsequent requests. Now the web server will understand, okay, this is the user that's involved. This would be the shopping cart that's involved, etc. So I'm going to go ahead and just press play here. And you notice if I type in Ravi and I press the login button, that's what shows up in the label. Now it doesn't matter what I type in here now. If I typed in Tom, for example, at this point session exists. You see Ravi already is stored in session. So it's not going to go out and change the session ID at all. The session object's already there. So we expect basically Ravi to still be up on the screen. And you could be down in here using your debugging windows and your watch windows. If you're troubleshooting session, that's going to be a very common thing to do. Add whatever the variable was you were looking for, to the watch. So this is just some common debugging things you might do with session. But the idea is you always should be checking for it again if you're going to be using session. Make sure that it even exists. In this case it does. Ravi is there. So the behavior we're going to expect is, since Ravi already exists in the session object, that he's just going to be showed on the screen here. It doesn't matter what we would type in the text box. We're going to get this from this. Now this could be database logic, not executing. Lots of different things could be happening if we're using like a shopping cart experience. We're just going to grab the data right out of session, and in this case right out of the process, the worker process, because that's how we're configured here. Now this is the point I kind of want to drive home, and you should know this for the exam. You can configure session state, what's called out of process, in a few different ways, and you're going to want to do that for a couple different reasons. One is, if I was just to save this web config file at this point, it's going to recycle the application domain. If I come back into that web page and I hit play, we lost session at that point. So session is now gone. So things like changes to web configs can recycle sessions, and this can be some unexpected behavior that you're not going to want. So you notice now session was gone when I went back through. I didn't restart the web app at all. Ravi should have still been in play in the session, but since that web app got recycled, and I showing this basically based on a web config change, then we lose session. So that's going to be a common thing you'll have to battle. You don't want to. Now there's several other reasons, such as on a schedule, the app domain is going to recycle. Several other reasons you may lose session, but be aware of that. So in-process sessions are fragile. This is an exam takeaway. For any real robust scenario, you're going to want to move your session out of process, out of this default model, because you're not going to be able to store session effectively. You're going to be lose sessions periodically anytime the app domain would recycle, which happens more often than you would think. So I've made a small change here. I've made session state equal to state server. This is one way. It could also be SQL server. State server is another ASP.NET process, perhaps even running on a different box, but it's not the default worker process here. So it's not going to be based on if we would lose that worker process, we can still keep state or keep session. So if I hit play here the first time through, you notice I'm going to populate session. We don't have it at this point. And the first thing you're going to see when you configure state server is, okay, we got this error. The state service has to be up and running for you to use it. So we're showing you here, you do not have to store this in the local worker process. You can certainly turn the state service on. This would have got installed with the .NET stuff. I'll go ahead and, since it's on the same machine I'm on, I'm just going to do a net start and then start the ASP.NET state service, which is ASP.NET_state. And this service will start. You could have also started it from the services snap-in. I'll go ahead and just hit the refresh button, and we'll now notice that we are storing session once again. Now the difference between this session that we're going to show you here, if I type in Dave again, the behavior is going to be very similar. It's going to we're still going to be using Ravi down here in the label because we have an existing session. This is not as fragile. If I make another web config change and I would save the web config, we won't lose session at this point. Session being stored out of process. It's not in the same worker process for where this web config lives. So I'll go ahead and hit save. We'll come and we'll be able to hit the login button again, and we still will see Ravi. If you see as I walk through the breakpoint, session is still there. We didn't lose session like we did in the previous example based on a web config change. And again, a web config change is only one reason out of many that you might lose your application domain or it may recycle. So you don't want to have fragile sessions. There are other reasons. When a web farm improc just doesn't work because you can't guarantee what server is going to get the request. Unless you're using something called sticky sessions or something like that. So most scenarios for robust enterprise applications, the best practice is going to be to get that session out of process, even though there's more performance penalty doing it this way. If I toggle back to improc here just to kind of drive the point home, at this point I just type in Ravi, I click play. Session does exist at this point, so we still see Becky on the screen. But the minute we change this web config or something else recycles this application domain, then all of a sudden session's going to be gone. So very fragile is improc, and even though it's very performant and it's the most performant way, usually not going to be a best practice. You're usually going to get it out of process. Now, you can store state or keep state with session, not just with the state service. You could also configure SQL Server. I encourage you to examine that on your own. Do research into that as well. There's also the custom option if you had some type of custom state mechanism. And again, if you're not going to use session state at all, you could set it off either at the page level for certain pages or the entire application via web config. A couple things we didn't talk about on the client side. If you went to the view source for any page, you notice this view state. Again, just by default, some of your controls is a hidden field that's back there. You can certainly add and remove things in view state as well programmatically. The query strings of a very popular area. You don't want to store like sensitive information. User ID might be okay up there. You have limitations on how much can be up there in the query string. You certainly wouldn't want sensitive data up there. It's less secure, etc. So you want to be careful. Pros and cons to all of these. Probably a combination of these techniques for keeping state. You can certainly get to the query string collection programmatically. It's very straightforward, easy to use. There's limitations on how much can be up there, how many characters, what kind of data. And there are limitations with session state in general as well. With classes, they must be marked as serializable. You can't store objects that are not. If you're going to use out-of-process session state. So there are various other techniques to use. You can also enable compression now with ASP.NET 4.0. If I was to turn what's called a cookieless session and set the cookieless equal to true, by default we're not going to be using the HTTP cookies anymore then to handle the session stuff. You'll notice your URL will change up here, and you would actually see this like weird looking characters up in the URL. This is with a GUID being used. Otherwise the state will act very similar or the same here. So again, there's multiple techniques for keeping state. This is a large topic. You're going to want to examine some more on your own. See our previous video series from Visual Studio 2008 where we went into a little more depth on the client-side stuff with view state, etc. And be aware of the nuances of configuring session state and the drawbacks as well as the pros for each approach.